The rain had been falling for hours, turning the dirt outside into thick brown rivers that clung to boots and swallowed wagon tracks whole. Inside the small log cabin at the edge of the prairie, Thomas Miller sat motionless in a rocking chair, his wide shoulders slumped, his weathered hands covering his face. The fire in the stone hearth crackled weakly, its warmth unable to reach the hollow ache in his chest. Behind him, his newborn son's cries rose and fell like the wind itself, piercing, desperate, the kind of sound that stripped a man to the bone. He had done everything he could think of. Cow's milk warmed over the fire, a bit of sugar to soften it. A rag dipped and squeezed between the baby's lips. Nothing worked. The boy turned his head, whimpered, and cried until his tiny lungs gave out, and his breaths came in broken gasps. Thomas's rough hands trembled as he lifted him again, whispering words that meant nothing now. "Shh, little one. Easy now. I'm right here." His voice cracked in the silence. "I ain't going nowhere, you hear?" But the baby only whimpered weakly, his cheeks burning with fever. Thomas swallowed hard, staring into the fire. The orange glow threw shadows across the room, illuminating the wooden cradle his wife had built with him before she died. Clara had been the soft heart of this place, her laugh, her hands, the smell of her bread. Now only the echo of her voice remained in the corners of the cabin, fading with every sunrise. He had buried her 2 months ago, out by the cottonwood tree near the creek. He had dug the grave himself with the same shovel he used for fence, posts, and every strike of the blade had felt like tearing out his own heart. The baby had been swaddled and quiet then, unaware of what was gone. But now, as if he could feel the emptiness, he cried day and night until the cabin felt like a tomb echoing with grief. Thomas leaned forward, pressing his forehead to the baby's. The child's skin was hot, his breath uneven. Panic began to rise in his chest. "Don't you quit on me," he whispered hoarsely. "You hear me, boy? Don't you dare quit." He stood up abruptly, pacing the room, his boots thudding on the rough planks. The rain pounded on the roof like hammer blows. Every sound outside, the thunder, the rustling trees, the crying wind, seemed to mock him, to remind him how small he was against it all. He had ridden to town yesterday, 20 long miles through mud and wind, carrying the baby wrapped in his old coat. The doctor had said there was nothing wrong with the child, only hunger. But there was no wet nurse willing to make the journey back to his ranch, not with the storm brewing. The old midwife had pressed his hand and said gently, "Sometimes God takes what he lent you. All you can do is pray." Thomas had prayed. He had begged. And now, as he stood alone in the dim cabin with the fire fading low, he felt his faith slipping like sand through his fingers. He tried the milk again, desperate. He poured a bit into a tin cup, dipped a rag, and offered it to the baby. The child turned his head away and whimpered, eyes barely open. Thomas cursed under his breath and slammed the cup onto the table. His voice broke as he spoke into the emptiness. "Clara, what am I supposed to do?" Only the rain answered him. He rocked the baby again, whispering the lullaby Clara used to hum, the one about the silver moon and the river that never ran dry. His low baritone voice trembled, the notes catching in his throat. For a moment the child quieted, eyelids fluttering. But then came another cry, weaker this time, and Thomas felt something inside him unravel. He placed the baby gently in the cradle, tucking the worn blanket tighter around him. Then he turned and reached for his coat. He couldn't stay here waiting for death to take another piece of his life. Somewhere, somehow, there had to be a woman, a mother, who could feed the boy. Even if he had to ride all night through the storm, he'd find her. He threw on his hat and reached for the latch. The wind howled against the door, rattling it on its hinges. His fingers gripped the cold metal. And then, 3 soft knocks. Thomas froze. No one came out here, not at night, not in the middle of a storm. The nearest neighbor was 8 miles away. He hesitated, his instincts prickling. His right hand moved toward the revolver on the table as he stepped closer to the door. The baby's cries had quieted to a soft whimper, as if even he sensed something had changed. Thomas drew a breath and pulled the door open. The wind rushed in, icy and sharp, carrying rain that stung his face. A figure stood on the porch, thin, soaked to the bone, and barely upright. It was a woman. Her dress clung to her frame, torn at the hem, her hair matted against her face. She looked like she'd walked through hell to get there. Her lips trembled as she spoke. "Please," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the storm. "I need food." Thomas stared, trying to make sense of it. "You'll freeze out here," he said, stepping back instinctively. "Come in." She hesitated, clutching her shawl tighter, as though unsure if she was welcome. Then a faint cry rose from the cradle behind him, the baby again, sharp and pitiful. The woman's head snapped toward the sound, her expression changing in an instant. "You have a baby?" she asked softly. He nodded slowly, wary but desperate. "My boy. He won't eat." For a heartbeat she stood there, trembling, staring past him at the cradle. Then her eyes filled with tears. "I can help him," she said, her voice breaking. "Please, sir, let me help." Thomas didn't move. His breath came unevenly as he studied her, thin, pale, a stranger in the dead of night. But there was something in her eyes he recognized, the hollow ache of loss, the same pain he'd been drowning in for weeks. "Come inside," he said finally. She stepped past him, shivering as she entered the warmth. The firelight flickered over her face, revealing the exhaustion etched deep in her features. She looked around the cabin, then at the baby. Thomas shut the door behind her. "Sit down. You look about ready to fall over." But she didn't sit. She took one slow step toward the cradle, her hand pressed to her chest. Her voice trembled as she whispered, "I lost my own baby last winter. I still have milk." Thomas felt his heart stop. For a long, silent moment, the only sound was the rain and the crackling fire. He didn't know what to say, what to feel. The world seemed to tilt around him. Then the baby cried again, thin, pleading, fading. The woman lifted her eyes to his. "Please," she said again, tears in her voice now. "Let me save him." Thomas's throat tightened. Slowly, he nodded. And as the wind howled outside, that starving mother stepped forward, carrying the only hope left in the world for a widowed cowboy and his dying child. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the land washed clean and shining under the pale light of dawn. The air smelled of wet earth and smoke. Thomas stood by the window for a long time, staring at the fields where mist curled low over the grass. Behind him the cabin was silent except for the soft crackle of the fire and the faint sound of breathing, two steady rhythms, the woman's and the baby's. He turned slowly, not quite trusting what he saw. The stranger, the one who had stumbled through the storm the night before, sat in the rocking chair, her dark hair loose and still damp, her face pale but calm. In her arms his son rested against her breast, sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. Thomas had seen life leave a body before. He had held men dying on battlefields, watched his wife take her final breath. He knew the difference between living and not living, and what he saw before him now was life, fragile and new. The baby's small lips moved softly. Content. His tiny fingers curled against the fabric of her dress. The woman hummed under her breath, a sound so gentle it barely stirred the air. It wasn't a tune he recognized, but it wrapped around the cabin like a prayer. He cleared his throat quietly. "How is he?" Her eyes lifted to meet his. They were tired but warm, holding a kind of light he hadn't seen in months. "He's full," she said softly. "He'll sleep now." Thomas nodded, unsure what to say. Words seemed too small for what she'd done. He took a few slow steps toward the hearth and crouched to add a log to the fire. When he turned back, she was looking down at the child again, a faint smile trembling on her lips. "What's your name?" he asked after a moment. "Evelyn," she answered. "Evelyn Gray." He nodded, the name feeling strange but right in the air of his cabin. "Thomas Miller." "I know," she said. "Your wife's grave by the cottonwood, I passed it." The marker said Clara Miller. He swallowed hard. The pain of her name still caught him by surprise, like a fist to the chest. "You walked from the creek?" Evelyn nodded. "I followed the sound of your baby crying. I thought maybe..." She stopped, her voice shaking. I thought maybe it was mine. Thomas looked at her for a long time. She seemed so fragile, he was afraid she might break just from speaking. Her dress was worn thin, her hands chapped and red. But there was a quiet strength in the way she held the baby. The same kind of strength he'd seen in his wife when she'd worked the fields beside him, belly round with new life. He poured her a cup of coffee and handed it to her. Drink this. You look about done in. She took it, her hands trembling slightly. Thank you. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that wasn't awkward but heavy with understanding. Outside, the rain dripped from the eaves, steady and rhythmic, like the ticking of time that had paused for them. When the baby finally stirred, Evelyn shifted, pulling him close again. Thomas turned away, unsure where to look, but her voice stopped him. It's all right, she said quietly. I know this isn't easy for you, but he needs this. He's hungry and I can still give. He nodded, jaw tight. You saved him. Evelyn looked down at the baby, a tear sliding down her cheek. Maybe he saved me. The words hung in the air, soft but sure. Thomas studied her face, the hollow cheeks, the exhaustion, but beneath it all, he saw something he recognized, a mother's heart. Battered but still beating. When she was done, she laid the baby gently in the cradle and tucked the blanket around him. He slept without a sound, breathing slow and deep. Evelyn brushed his forehead with her fingertips before looking up. He's strong, she said quietly. He'll make it now. Thomas swallowed the lump in his throat. You should rest too. You can stay here as long as you need. She hesitated, uncertainty flickering in her expression. I don't want to be a burden. You're not, he said firmly. You came when I needed you most. That ain't something I forget. Evelyn nodded slowly and lowered herself onto the small cot near the fire. Within minutes, her breathing evened, her hand still half extended toward the cradle as if afraid to let go. Thomas watched her for a long while. Then he went outside to feed the horse, the crisp air biting his face. The sun was climbing, gold spilling across the wet grass. The land was still, almost sacred. He looked toward the cottonwood tree in the distance where a wooden cross stood among the wildflowers. You'd tell me to keep her here, wouldn't you, Clara? He murmured. You always had a heart big enough for strays. Days passed, and the rhythm of life returned to the cabin in ways Thomas hadn't imagined possible. Evelyn stayed, helping where she could. She cooked what little they had, mended clothes, and sang to the baby until the nights no longer felt so long. Her laughter was quiet at first, as if she'd forgotten how to use it. But it came more often with each passing morning, soft and sincere. Thomas worked the land again. The fences needed mending, the cattle needed checking, and now when he came back at dusk, he didn't walk into silence. He walked into warmth, the smell of stew, the hum of a lullaby, the sound of life. One evening, he found her out by the porch, sitting with the baby in her arms. The sun was setting, painting the horizon in gold and pink. The wind carried the scent of grass and wild sage. You sure he's full? He asked gently, stepping beside her. She smiled faintly, rocking the child. He's content. That's all that matters. Thomas leaned against the railing, watching the sky darken. After a moment, he said, You ever think about leaving? Heading back east or somewhere else? Evelyn shook her head. There's nothing left for me anywhere else. My husband's gone. My home's gone. All I have is what's in my arms. She looked down at the baby, her voice softening. And maybe what's in front of me. Thomas looked at her then. Not as a stranger, not even as a guest, but as someone who belonged. The thought startled him, but it felt right, deep down where grief had long turned to stone. He took a slow breath. You saved my boy, Evelyn. If you ever need a home. He paused, choosing the words carefully. You already found one. She looked up, eyes glistening in the dying light. Thank you, Thomas. The baby stirred, making a small sound, and she smiled, whispering something only he could hear. Thomas watched them, this woman, this child, and felt something shift inside him. Hope, fragile and unfamiliar, but real. When darkness finally fell, the three of them went inside. Evelyn laid the baby in the cradle, the same one that had once been a symbol of grief but now felt like a promise. Thomas lit the last candle and stood watching them, his heart too full for words. Evelyn looked over her shoulder and caught his gaze. You should rest too, she said softly. I will, he murmured. Just a minute. He stayed there until the candle burned low, until the fire's glow turned the room into gold and shadow. The woman who had arrived starving and broken now slept peacefully, and the baby she'd saved breathed steady in the quiet. Outside, the wind whispered through the plains, carrying away the last traces of the storm. Inside, the widowed cowboy and the mother who had nothing left found something neither of them expected, a second chance at life, born from hunger, mercy, and the quiet bond of saving each other.